Yeah, just wanted to say a few words of thanks, firstly to Prof. Tay himself for making himself available, as he always does, through his books and through his physical appearance at events, very frequent and prolific. Always sharing your words of wisdom for the different generations. Thanks a lot for that. Thanks to Bookbar for providing the space. Please buy drinks, makan, whatever you want to support Bookbar. And also, Keng Soon's latest book that we'll be talking about is available for sale. So please consider purchasing a copy as well. There's a whole stack over there. It's going to be quite informal and conversational like most of our events, so please feel free to put up your hand, ask a question whenever you want. We'll have it as a bit of a conversation. This book, there are just so many ideas in here that I've decided to just sort of shortlist 2 or 3 questions that I'm going to ask Keng Soon, and then after that we'll just open it to the floor for a conversation. First, let me give you a very short introduction to Prof. Keng Soon. I just selected bits from his long bio that I thought are the most interesting. Otherwise, I could spend a long time reading out your bio. Anyway, Keng Soon was a practicing architect registered in Singapore and Malaysia and was adjunct professor at NUS. He was a founding member of the Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group in 1968 that pioneered many new planning and developmental concepts which contributed to Singapore's development. So I think we'll be talking a lot about those early days of Singapore's development and how some of the decisions made then sort of influence where we are today as a society. He was president of the Singapore Institute of Architects from 1990 to 1993. His design, for those of you who need reminding of some of the enduring landmarks in Singapore, his design of Golden Mile Complex was accorded preservation status by URA in 2021. And yeah, now we're here to discuss his latest book. A lot of interesting stuff in there. I urge you all to pick it up and flick through it. On housing, on migrant worker dormitories. I love this little section on aesthetics as well, breaking down aesthetics. I'll just quote. I spoke of reviving our primary senses through understanding the structure of aesthetics and of thought, thereby freeing ourselves from orthodoxy. Most people won't believe that aesthetics can be a trap. Aesthetics is a general term that encompasses taste, beauty, and art. So this book is filled with little philosophical musings like that from Keng Soon, alongside a lot of the more policy-oriented type messages of his. Another one, Marx's dialectical materialism has to be understood through the different levels of consciousness of Buddhist thought. This is another line from Keng Soon's book. So yeah, I urge you to pick it up later. I'm going to start with my first question, and this is one of the stories about Keng Soon that I love, about how you lobbied for Changi as the site of our airport. And I believe the Public Works Department at the time actually wanted to expand Paya Lebar Airport as opposed to having a new airport at Changi. And Keng Soon was part of the group that lobbied for Changi to be the site of our new airport. So, you want to just talk us through that whole incident and what happened then?
Well, first of all, Sudhir, thanks very much for being the quiz master today. Yeah, and I also want to shout out for your Zoom project, which I think is a very necessary adjunct to the Singapore media landscape, because there's too much one track reporting in Singapore. And thank you for providing a different point of view. Okay. Singapore Planning and Urban Research Group was started in actually in '65, right? As a group of young architects, but some not so young. And then after a while, it began to attract a lot of academics from the university, from economics, from political science, from geography, from sociology. So we had a very widespread of intellectual thinking people. Okay, now the airport. Airport was one of the most controversial, was in fact the first controversial project which Spur did, and it incurred the wrath of the Ministry of National Development, okay, who at that time was in charge of the Public Works Department. Now here's also some very interesting fact which many people ought to know. There are insiders and outsiders in our system, right? And most of us who are not in the insiders are by definition outsiders. And outsiders are always treated with brushed off. We are insignificant. However, because of friendships that we have with people among the insiders, one of the engineers in the Public Works Department was a good friend. He smuggled out a map that showed the Changi Paya Airport expansion. And we were completely aghast at it because there would be 2 new runways in addition to the existing runway. And it showed the flight path coming in and egressing. And in airport planning, you have to plan for the crash zone, right? In case the airplane coming in crashes. So there has to be a crash zone. And nobody is allowed to live within the crash zone. And also there's a noise zone. So in effect, the Paya expansion proposal would mean that the whole of Mountbatten and Geylang area would not be livable. And also the Pasir Ris and Tampines area will be also unlivable. In other words, 1/4 of the whole of Singapore will not be livable. Given the shortage of land and so on, it becomes an unacceptable thing. So what we did was we called a press conference and we showed the map to the press and explained that this is incredible. This is not a good idea at all. And this was on the 27th of January in 1971. Okay. Interestingly, that the British announced the closure of the Changi Airport, which was used by the RAF, to move RAF to Tengah Airport. So that means that at the end of 71, the Changi Airport becomes available. Now, interestingly, also it coincides with, I just was watching a very interesting video on Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson's second term as Prime Minister of Britain was 1974, okay, until 76. Then he retired in 76. In Kuan Yew's book, Kuan Yew declared that Harold Wilson was a very good friend. And it was Harold Wilson who then gave all the military bases and all the land that were occupied by the British military forces in Singapore back to Singapore for $2. So this is a very great gift by Harold Wilson to Lee Kuan Yew and to Singapore. So between early 1971 and late 1971, that 11 or 12 months, Spur got the real scolding and threats from the Permanent Secretary of Ministry of National Development, Mr. Hao Yu Chong at that time. So we were really, thrown into the bad books of government. But to his credit, towards the end of 71, he then championed the idea to move to Changi, and that's what happened, right? But it took a while, several years before that was actuated because of Harold Wilson. So that's the story.
Wait, so just to understand this insider and outsider discourse and relationship, which I find quite interesting. So somebody on the inside passed you this map,
Yeah.
and you guys basically leaked publicly the map lah at a press
We
conference.
went public completely.
Yeah.
We called a press conference, gave it to the press.
And was there any worry that you would be getting the insiders into trouble, or was there that whole thing going on?
I'm not sure about that, but because the insider was a guy called Ku Ting Chai, is it? No, I can't remember his full name. But he then resigned from PWD and became the head of Singapore Polytechnic. So I think he knew that he had to carry some of the burdens.
And if you contrast it to today, because I think illiberal or autocratic systems all over the world have this insider-outsider dynamic going on, where information is shared and passed. And if you compare the late 60s, early 70s to today, how is your relationship with the so-called insiders now in the system? And is there still this kind of sharing of information? And
it's a very interesting question that you are posing, because it reminds me of what happened to me in '68. Okay, and I think it has something to do with the '71 event later, right? In 1968, I organized in Spur an exhibition of Singapore's past, present, and future. Right, it was a public exhibition held at the Esplanade. That's the original Esplanade, which is the green belt between the sea and Connaught Drive, okay, right next to the Padang. And the site that I chose was directly next to the cenotaph, because I wanted to use the cenotaph platform as a platform for communicating with public. Interestingly, you talk about insider and outsider at that time, it wasn't that distinct, because I wrote to Lee Kuan Yew, right, and asked him to be patron of the exhibition. And he agreed, to my surprise. He agreed, and he wrote a very laudatory foreword to the exhibition, which is published now. You can get hold of it. And then at the exhibition itself, I asked him to officiate the opening of the exhibition. He said he was too busy, and he assigned Rahim Ishak, who is the brother of Yusof Ishak, who was the president of Singapore. Rahim Ishak was a member of parliament, to officiate at the exhibition. And at the exhibition, we took him around, and he became more and more irritated as he saw the exhibition. And when he came to the part where we exhibited the pictures, these were huge photographs, A1 size photographs of HDB flats. And I had posted next to it a picture of chicken coops, and he was really annoyed. Yeah, and he stormed out. Okay, and then the insider-outsider problem began seriously from then. But even then, interestingly, is that as the relationship between Spur and the administration became more and more strained, Lee Kuan Yew actually stepped in. This is the difference between then, the politics then and the politics now. Lee Kuan Yew then called for a dinner, a two-table dinner in Istana, right? He sat here, this is a table, he sat here, he put me next to him, and next to him was the chief planner. Okay? And the bureaucrats were put in a second table. That was his way of telling them, hey, you must know your place, okay? So this is very unusual. that he was trying to mend, in his way of mending, the divide between the insider and the outsiders, right? And I can remember very distinctly a very interesting situation. So in that round table, when you sat here, directly opposite him was Mrs. Lee, right? And Kuan Yew was going on about this and that and so on and so forth. And Mrs. Lee, we were all shocked. From across the table, she pointed her finger at him. Harry, you shouldn't be saying things like that. My God, it was absolutely stunned, see? So in a very interesting way, we, the outsiders, were kind of brought into some kind of acceptance, right? To be even allowed to sit in that round table with him, right? So it was a very interesting situation. And I think that it had some impact on the bureaucracy, and I think the impact was twofold. One was a certain deference to us, which is expected, but on the other hand, a heightened disgust with us, right? And this was expressed in various ways throughout the Spur, the life of Spur. Now, this is something you all should understand. The Western media was also rather critical of the politics in Singapore throughout that early period. 1971 was the closure of all the newspapers other than the Straits Times newspapers, right? And so it all happened within that from the late 60s to the early 70s, that whole period was, I think, a very important transitional period between a kind of emerging democracy and its closure. So I think that was a very interesting moment. So when the newspapers was being closed, the International Press Institute held a conference in Helsinki. Okay. Now this is a project which I was involved in and has nothing to do with Spur. I, together with two other people, formed a group to take over the Singapore Herald, which was the other English language newspaper, which was challenging the Straits Times. I mean, there was another paper, which is the Eastern Sun, which was financed by the All family, the Auburn Hall family, and the key person in charge was Miss Ossian from Hong Kong. Okay? The charge that was levied against them was that it was a foreign operation to infiltrate the media landscape of Singapore. And that same charge was leveled against the Singapore Herald, right? So that's why me and a few others decided to take over the paper as a fully Singaporean-owned cooperative, right? And Tommy Koh agreed to be the chairman of the cooperative. And so we had a meeting with Mr. Rajarana, who was the Minister of Culture, and he was very sympathetic to the idea, and he said to us that I think it's important to have a second English language paper, right? So we felt rather optimistic that we could get the license. But alas, when we applied for the license on Monday, it was refused. Because on Sunday, Lee Kuan Yew was in Helsinki, and Lee Kuan Yew was asked by the Press Institute, are you going to give license to the Singapore Herald Cooperative? And he said, he brushed it off. He just said, it's just a ploy. And that was the end of it. Okay, so now, and I think that was the beginning of that experiment which I think Lee Kuan Yew undertook to try and moderate the insider-outsider divide. And I think that was the end of it.
So, I mean, the sort of fervent activism that you and your comrades put forth could have also turned him off in many ways, right?
Oh, I'm sure, because by that time we had incurred so many enemies within the administration and the political elements and so on. But again, later on, I will also elaborate that even then, there were still friends within the insiders that would help us on difficult situations, which some of which I talked about in the book. You might have seen it.
Yeah. Any questions on this insider-outsider democratic activism? Yeah, I find this quite an amazing story because I can't imagine the current government, their plans somehow being leaked and then somehow being forced to make a major infrastructural or urban planning change based on lobbying from an outside group. But this is exactly what happened back then. Second question, a little bit lighter, a little bit more almost philosophical. Keng Soon and I often talk about the Malayan identity, this amorphous, lost Malayan identity, in this parallel world where perhaps Singapore and Malaysia were still one country. And whenever we meet, I kind of ask him for his thoughts on this. So, what is the Malayan spirit that you grew up with, and what's your current conception of it, given geopolitical realities and developments? And just one small point to make about this question, it's something that Keng Soon talks about in this book, The Resurgence of the Malayan Identity, and he also frames it in terms of the need for greater regionalization, the need for Singapore to form better links with our immediate neighbors. So, what's the Malayan spirit or Malayan identity you grew up with, and what do you think it is today or might be today?
Okay, there are many dimensions here. My earliest memory was actually December the 8th, 1941. Okay, that was my birthday, my first birthday, and I remember the sound of the bombs coming in. Okay, and the whine of the bomb, and then the thud, and then the explosion. Right.
You have a memory from 1 year old.
Yeah, exactly. This is So a lot of people say that cannot be true, right? But I checked with my mother because I asked her what was the sandbags, because I remember the sandbags that were the whole family hid under the concrete staircase. You see, in a 2-story terrace house where we were living. So the concrete staircase was, my parents thought was the safest place to be in the house was bombed, right? And it was surrounded by sandbags. And I said to her, I remember the smell of the gunny sack. Okay? She said, what was the smell? I said, it's gunny sack smell. And she confirmed it, you see. Therefore, it confirmed to my mind that I wasn't imagining it. It was the smell of it, right? Yeah. Then of course the whole family then moved to Cameron Highlands, where we had a glorious time as little children. I was there from 2 years old to 4 years old, and it was if you ask me how did you experience Second World War, I said it was a fantastic fun time. Yeah, we were farmers, we were growing food, right? And I remember very clearly, this is part of the Malayan identity, you see, right? It's the geography, the geography of the territory that kind of lived with me throughout. Okay? So the identity, after we left Malaysia 65, in 1965 we left, and in the book I mentioned about my interpretation of why Lee Kuan Yew cried. I think you asked me that question, right? Why did Lee Kuan Yew cry? Well, first of all, I think Lee Kuan Yew is a very complex person, and you cannot really know what's going on in his mind. But I imagine that he cried because his Malayan identity was completely shattered. You see, because because he had fought for very hard for the previous 2 to 3 years of why Singapore must join Malaysia. Because he's a Malayan, okay? And also his economic sense is that unless we have a hinterland, it's very difficult to have a negotiating position, a viable negotiating position with the Euro-American forces that, although decolonization had already occurred, right? But a new global order under the Euro-American order was already coming into force to kind of overarch over all the developments in the post-colonial world. So, Kuan Yew, being an intelligent person, must have realized that once you have lost your hinterland, you have lost your bargaining position, and therefore you have to become a servant of the Anglo-American order. And it is not in his character to be the servant of anybody. Okay? And I think that was what hit him deeply, and he was completely shattered by it. Okay? And a good friend of mine who has a record of Lim Chong Yew was the only Malaysian leader that visited Kuan Yew when Kuan Yew was crying and hiding in a bungalow in Changi Point. You know, he was in a terrible state of mind, and he secluded himself in that bungalow for 1 month. And Lim Chong Yew visited him, and Chong Yew has a record, which my friend has a copy of, that he actually met him and confirmed that he was absolutely psychologically distraught. So when people say that when Kuan Yew cried, it was crocodile tears, that's absolutely not true. Right? It was a real shattering of his whole worldview, you know, and his whole identity was completely shattered. So I think that is that's him as a Malayan. Now the other part of the Malayan thing is the cultural identity part of it. Some of which I think has retained in our multiculturalism of Singapore, right? But before coming here, I was at the exhibition at the National Library of the 4 artists, the Nanyang artists who went to Bali. And interestingly, it was for these China-trained artists like Chen Wen-si, Chong Su-peng, Yu Kang, and several others. These were Chinese artists trained in Shanghai that migrated to Singapore after the 49, when the Chinese Communist Party took over China. They migrated, and being totally Chinese in their identity and their outlook, decided that they must understand and learn to appreciate the culture of Southeast Asia. Their main aim was, I didn't know this until I saw the exhibition, their main aim was to go to Malaya to find themes for the art. But because 1948 was the beginning of the emergency, they were not allowed to go to Malaya. So the next best thing for them, they went to Bali. And if you go to see the exhibition, it's an incredible exhibition because Liu Kang took 1,000 photographs, right, which Gretchen just discovered in a shoebox. She is the daughter-in-law of Liu Kang. And it was really, and they said very clearly in the write-up about the exhibition which was in 1952, they had a public exhibition in Singapore, and they said that it was a huge experience for them, and they in a sense, they found the art, the inspiration of art for their art in Southeast Asia. So this was a very important thing. So I think the artistic tradition, and then of course you have the poetry, which I mentioned in the book, right, by Edwin Tambu, right, and a few other poets who wrote about that period. And then finally, the young Alfian Saad, right, who wrote this fantastic volume, and this poem called Singapore, You're Not My Country, which is in the book. So he's, I think, one of the last young Malayans left, right? So when we left Malaysia and Singapore had to become a global city, right? We had to reinvent a whole identity, which is now, even till now, is in a kind of a fluid state of, I wouldn't want to use the identity crisis as a term that describes the current kind of identity situation, but I would say that we are identity-wise rather confused. So when Habibie, the former president of Indonesia, criticized Singapore, calling it a little red dot, it's strange that suddenly this little red dot idea encapsulated the new Singapore identity. Because the Malayan identity was an expansive identity. It was a progressive identity, right? It had formative potential, right? But the little red dot is a kind of introspective identity. You know, it's turning inwards to celebrate smallness as a virtue. So I think that we are in that strange situation, you know? And I would like to hear some of your other views, especially from the younger people. What do you think of the Singapore identity now, you see? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll take some questions and I might come back to that. But Alex just flashed a very interesting book. Can you just show that book which ties into what you just said? I hadn't even seen this book. So
this book by Gretchen.
So this is the book about the Nanyang artist.
Nanyang artist, yeah.
Yeah, so flick through that later if you're interested. Yeah, did anybody want to jump in here with any thoughts?
I just want to raise a point. Even though we are part of, even though we joined Malaysia in 1963, but I thought we were treated as Singapore-born people, Singapore citizens, not Malaysian citizens. We had nationality, Malaysian nationality, but we remained as Singapore citizens. And I remember personally, 1965, once we declared independence, I went and played football. I was so happy we separated Malaysia because I thought it was becoming very racial. And then by the end of the year, they removed national language teaching. There was no compulsory national language learning. So Malay became a second language, just like other languages, you know. Can you elaborate on this, the dual identity that Singaporeans had in Malaysia?
Well, there are all kinds of theories about why Singapore left Malaysia, right? The idea of the Malaysian Malaysia, right, was a concept which was generated by Lim Chong Yu in Penang, and also by Lee Kuan Yew, right? They were very much for the idea of a multiracial Malaysia. And I don't think they took enough credence of the idea of Malay supremacy. And I think the Ketuanan Melayu as an idea was always there. And it became a lot more pronounced in later years, right? And today, even today, Anwar Ibrahim has to deal with Ketuanan Melayu because although Anwar is a much more communitarian idea, he believes in a multiracial, progressive, modern society, but he has to deal with the fact of Ketuanan Melayu. For those who do not know the term Ketuanan Melayu, Ketuanan means Tuan is boss. So Ketuanan means the supremacy of the Malay race. Okay, and supremacy of the Malay race had to be expressed in language, in culture, in the arts, in education, in business, in administration. So this was the overarching ideology that Kuan Yew, I think, did not pay enough attention to it. He was impatient. He was a young fellow at that time. He pushed very hard for multiracialism, and the backlash was incredible. There were several race riots, right, both in Malaysia and in Singapore, right, and that led to the total separation. Does that answer your question?
I would like to touch on your previous statement about being a servant of. I would like to touch on your previous statement about being a servant of the Anglo-Americans. At least in my personal experience, I find that as a young person, many people in our generation do not really understand what it is to be Asian, I feel. And to what extent would you say being a servant of the Anglo-Americans is a threat to Singapore's future?
Good question, yeah. And I'm glad you asked because I think you're right. Many of the younger people don't understand this at all because you are actually living in that normality. So therefore you cannot know, right, what other perceptions there might be because you are living in it, okay? And in the book I mentioned this, that there was a very important meeting in 1945 at Yalta. The Yalta conference in 1945 was attended by Winston Churchill, representing Britain, Franklin Roosevelt, who represents America, and Joseph Stalin represented the USSR. Okay, that meeting was to decide the world after World War II. The meeting in 45 was just before the end of the war. Okay. At that meeting, there's a very interesting picture. You see, the three of them were sitting like that, right? Stalin was here, Roosevelt was here, and Churchill was here, and Roosevelt was leaning over, talking to Churchill, basically saying to him, you have to decolonize. And you have to decolonize because we are taking over. Okay? And Stalin was leaning over trying to listen to that. See? That is actually what happened. Okay? And what does the global order, the Euro-American order mean after World War II? British colonies were decolonized. The first was India, and then Indonesia fought for the independence from the Dutch, right? Malaya got independence in 56, 57, 56, and we 65. The war was going on in in Indochina, right? When you ask what was the role of Singapore, Singapore was the military supply base for the American war in Vietnam. All the weapons were transshipped from Singapore, right? And interestingly, and that has not even stopped. There was a very interesting video which I saw recently of the Kursk, the war between Russia and Ukraine in Kursk, right? The Russians had infiltrated to the behind
Through the gas pipeline, right?
through the gas pipeline, and the Ukrainians were trapped, and they abandoned their weapons. And there was a film showing a Russian soldier looking at the weapons, and he picked up one weapon made in Singapore. Okay, so that's very clear that Singapore is. I use the term servant because that's my point of view. But in the global order, right, Singapore is an ally of America. We have a military alliance with America, right? When the Ukraine war started, Singapore's foreign minister issued a statement. Vivian Balakrishnan issued a statement saying that the war there are two reasons why we are against the war. Number one, as a small state that is vulnerable, we are in principle against any foreign attack by any country towards another country. So in terms of UN concept, we are in principle, we condemn that kind of action. So that's, to me, completely legitimate. But the second point which was made by Balakrishnan was the Russian attack on Ukraine was unprovoked. The term unprovoked was completely a copy of the American statement. This is when I use the term a slave of the Anglo-American order, that's exactly what it means, right? And then that's in military and in foreign policy aspects, right? But in terms of economics, right? The Euro-American investment in Singapore, right? After 65, is incredible. It's huge, right? The Western Alliance investment in Singapore uses Singapore as a major entry point into the whole of Southeast Asia, right? And then now, because of the rise of China, right, there's a whole new power dynamics that's emerging, and we are in this strange position. And how strange can it be when our Minister of Defense, Nguyen Hien, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, made a public statement quoting Asian sources, not his own view, but quoting Asian sources to say that America is behaving like a landlord trying to collect rent. That is absolutely shocking to me. Does it indicate a shift in Singapore's foreign policy position in relation to the United States? Right? All the time, we have always tried to play this balancing act, right? Although, of course, we are allied to American interests, right? But at the same time, the biggest trading partner for Singapore is China. So we have to play this balancing act, right? Are we abandoning the balancing act, right? Are we going to join BRICS? Since Malaysia has joined BRICS, is going to join BRICS, but has not been confirmed yet. Thailand has been confirmed. Indonesia has been confirmed. Has Singapore applied? We do not know, right? And if it applies, will it be accepted? Because at the same time, in the Russia-Ukraine war, Singapore has imposed sanctions on Russia. which is very strange. So all our investment in Russia were taken over by Russians. So this is we are in a very interesting conflicted situation.
A couple of questions. So we've become sort of a servant of the neoliberal global capitalist order from sort of 65 onwards. And do you think Kuan Yew, and I'll call him Kuan Yew since you're calling him Kuan Yew, do you think Kuan Yew actually had alternatives at that point in time, or did the loss of the Malaysian hinterland leave him actually with very few alternatives than the path that he pursued? So that's first question, and second question is how do you see the current situation given Trump and the rise of China and everything else, which you talk a bit about in the book?
Yeah, I think I already explained that why he cried, right?
Yeah.
It was a traumatic experience for him. Being a pragmatic realist, he came to terms with it. And he, together with, I think the term Singapore as a global city in which the world is our hinterland, right, was a concept that was generated by, I think, was Rajaratnam. But it, I think, encapsulated the new role of Singapore very well, okay? And here is where it's very important to understand, and I try to understand it, why he went to the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School in 1968 and spent 3 months there. Okay? I theorize that he went there in order to form friendships with the key people in the United States. And that's where he actually became a buddy of Henry Kissinger. And through him, he had entry into all the elite of United States, right? Because I think he knew that if you want to be effective within the Anglo-American order, you better have good friends at the highest level, right? I mean, he was practical and smart. But I explained this, I expressed this to Professor Wang Gangwu, right? And Gangwu told me, no, that may be part of the thing. Because Gangwu said that he had friends in Harvard at the time when Kuan Yew was there, and that his friends told him that the real reason why Kuan Yew went to Harvard was to learn how to outtalk Goh Keng Swee. And I think we need to talk about Goh Keng Swee's role in Singapore, and particularly in the early formative years of Singapore, right? The kind of social democracy that was being promoted by Raja, by Toh Chin Chai, by Goh Keng Swee, and so on. So the emerging neoliberal order that was coming about, arising from, and there's a whole story to that which I slightly touched upon in the book, right? In the influence of Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, who had tremendous influence over Milton Friedman, who was the economist in University of Chicago, who was the chief ideologue, economic ideologue of the Republican Party, and they all had to read Milton Friedman's books on the market economy, the reduction of reducing the administrative influence over market economy, right? Because there was always this tension between the social protection and market economy. right? Which social protection was pushed by the Democratic Party, and economic development, free market economy was pushed by the Republicans. And today we have this total upset where the corruption of the Democratic Party is being revealed by the Trump administration, right, which are the kind of ultra-right of the Republican Party. So we are now seeing this huge transformation in America, and which will have impact on the Euro-American order, which will have an impact on us. So,
so you do believe that the Trump administration is exposing genuine corruption in the Democratic Party?
I think the revelations by Elon Musk in Doge, right? It's hard to refute. Yeah.
Okay. I do know that you have a quote and photograph of Elon Musk in this book, by the way.
Yeah.
Just saying. Any?
So, Professor Day, when you decided to write this book, did you write as an insider or as an outsider? Where were you at? Intellectually?
In no sense can I be called an insider.
How does one decide, like, to write a book like that? Because you were sort of privileged to be inside, the inside
No, inside
guy.
at all. Never be inside.
No, never?
Never.
Wow, okay, I got that wrong. So inside, no, so outside, yes?
Okay, I have to clarify that a bit. Huh?
Yeah.
In 1968, I had written an essay, Housing, Identity and Nation Building,
Yeah.
right? I wrote it when I was 26 years old. And George Thompson was the left behind person by the British colonial power to act as a kind of advisor to Lee Kuan Yew, right? And George was very close to me because George was very interested in SPUR, Singapore Planning Urban Research Group, right? Because George is a kind of liberal person. So George sent a copy of my essay to Lee Kuan Yew, and then Kuan Yew called me out. So we had a meeting in Kuan Yew's office, one-to-one, nobody else was there, okay? And Kuan Yew said to me, I read your paper, interesting, but there's one point which I totally disagree with you. And that is that in my paper, he says, I advocated the preservation of the kampongs, right? And he says, no way, we must demolish all the kampongs in Singapore because they are a den of iniquity and they are backward and we must get rid of all of them. So I counter-argue with him. We had an argument for about half an hour. And I said, no, the kampong spirit, is something that we must treasure, right? The gotong royong spirit, which is the mutual help cultural arrangement between kampong people. And kampong people were not just Malays, they were Indians, Chinese, all living together, right? Although predominantly the major Malay kampongs were mainly Malay, right? So he was totally disagreed with me. And then abruptly he stood up and left the meeting. Okay? But I was so shocked. 1 week later, George called me. Says, he wants you to join him. I said, what for? He wants an architect in his team. So I said, no, let me think about it. So I felt that I cannot be under anybody's thumb. That's not my nature. Okay? So I refused. And Connie was very upset. That's what George told me later, that he was very upset. He thought, the exact words of George to me was, he thought the less of you. That's the story. So I was never an insider, right? But interestingly, and in the book, there are people inside in important positions that respect the integrity and integrity of people, of some people, outsiders, who are outsiders. Okay, I gave a few examples, right? For example, I had published my research work on high density, low rise housing, which was a critique of the housing board proposals for Toa Payoh New Town. After the building of the first public housing in 1960, 61, 60 in Queenstown, the next big project, HDB big project, was Toa Payoh, okay? And so the plans were produced, and I looked at them and I say, what the hell? The plot ratio is only 1.4. Do you know what plot ratio is? That's the total floor area in relation to the land area on which the buildings are to be put, right? So if plot ratio of 1 means the total land area is the total floor area is the same as the total land area on which the building stands, okay? So 1.4 means slightly more than what the land area is. So I did my calculations and I did the designs, and I could do it with 4-story buildings. Why build 10-story buildings? And bearing in mind at that time that many of the Singaporeans that were going to be rehoused were rehoused from kampong areas. They were all living in attic huts and houses on the ground. And for them to be moved into high-rise buildings was traumatic, and they didn't like it at all. So typically you will see that the booking pattern, if you have a big block of flats like that, right, say 10 stories, right, the booking pattern will be like that. So the corner units will be taken up, the lower units will all be taken up, the big bulk of the units in the center and to the top are empty, nobody wants them, right? So I presented, I was then invited by the Rotary Club Central to present my research work, and it was presented, and Straits Times published front page, no need for high-rise housing in Singapore. Wow, Mr. Teh Chiang Man, who was the chief architect of HDB at that time, was furious, right? So I was completely condemned as a fraud and so on and so forth. And then later on, many years later, he never forgot, I was commissioned to design dairy farm condominium. Do you all know what dairy farm is? Right, it's off Bukit Timah. Yeah. And I submitted my designs. I was appointed by Robert Koch, one of the biggest developers in Southeast Asia, right? And every time I submitted the plans, it was refused with strange reasons, which didn't make sense at all. So then I confided in one of the PAP members of Parliament, who is a good friend. You see, the insider, right? I'm an outsider consulting an insider. Hey, I asked my insider friend, what the hell is going on? So he says, let me check with the man. So he went to see Teh Chiang Wan, and Teh Chiang Wan says, tell your friend Teh Keng Soon to confess that he's wrong. Okay? So my friend told me that. So I said, okay, I'll write him a letter. I wrote him a letter. Knowing that he's Chinese educated, his English not so good, I said, my ideas about high density, low rise are not practicable. He doesn't understand the difference between practical and practicable. It's not practicable because of him. So he was very gratified. And my friends who were in the housing board, architect friends, the HDB was housed one floor below his office in Maxwell Road, Ministry of National Development building, and they told me that that the minister Teh Cheng Wan came down, waved my letter to everybody, and said, "Teh Keng Soon has confessed." So that's how friends within help us, and there were several other stories about this, right?
Were your plans approved after that? Or dairy farm?
Oh, my plans were approved immediately after that. So you can see that the planning department process, the administrative process, was completely controlled by the government, right? I give you another example. I won the design competition for the KK Hospital, right? The original KK Hospital design competition, which I won, was in the old KK Hospital complex itself, okay? Which was on the other side of Jalan Kampong Java, right? And then a new piece of land became available because the graveyard there was exhumed, and the Public Works Department then reassigned the project to be on the new site, but they took it over. And I was, although I had won the competition, I was not allowed to be the architect. So Mr. Dana Balan, now a minister, right, who was a good friend of me, because I was president of the Singapore Institute of Architects, and he was the minister, right, who took over from Teh Cheng Wan, who had committed suicide, right? And Dana then spoke to me. He says, "Tell me about it." And I told him about it, that I won a competition, and those who win a competition are entitled to be the architect for the project, right? But the project was taken away by Public Works Department. So he said, "This is outrageous. This is unacceptable. Let me do something about it." And he did it. He said, 1 week later, he called me and says, "I can give you back the design part of the project, but the rest of the project was taken over by Public Works Department." And Public Works Department was so aggrieved by it that they did not even allow me on the site thereafter. So this is the insiders helping me, and then the insiders bad reaction. So this is the dynamics of the insider-outsider relationships. It's not so simple.
Yeah, maybe I'll take one or two more. There might be people wanting to buy your book and talk to you as well. So I guess insider, outsider, just a very quick comment. I mean, this is not from me, but Cherian George often says, I think that there are many shades of grey, and it's obviously not a binary. I suspect Mr. Teh is one of the grey zone people. So any last?
In the past, even though LKY was a very strong personality, even though LKY was a very strong views, and he was still willing to sit down and talk to people who had a different view. And he would, at the end of the day, make a decision. His decision will stand. But today, we are not even willing to listen to an alternative view, and we have POFMA. And what they classify as lies are not lies, it's just another point of view. So what is your view on this?
It's such a complicated issue. I don't know where to start. I think that if you look at history, the transition from one stage to a new stage, there is that transitional moment And the transitional moment is always very confusing and also very internally contradicting. Okay? I think that the present power elite are going through this transition. In any kind of political system, there is always the good cop and the bad cop. Okay? I think Lawrence Wong is trying very hard to be a good cop. But if he is to succeed, I think he needs a bad cop that is a bit more subtle. The big, to swing the big hatchet very publicly may be out of tune with the new requirements. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if the bad cop will be changed, because it's out of sync.
We're talking about Shan, right? Just to be clear, is it? Yeah?
I don't want to name names now.
Oh, don't name names. I will name. We're talking about Shan.
Yeah.
That's if they have someone skillful enough to be a subtle bad cop. I think that is a hard line to, going to be a hard line.
It's not easy. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But
do they even recognize that problem?
sorry.
Do they even recognize that problem?
When you say they, it's quite a I think in the transition situation, there will be different points of view, right? I wouldn't be surprised if there are different factions within the power elite.
We have time for, because so far, right, we've been covering a lot of Singapore, but I think moving forward, maybe we need to think about regionalization, working with our northern and southern neighbors. I know Prof. Tay works in the Asian Dialogue Society. Perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the ADS projects?
Yeah, in the title of the book, Future of Singapore with a question mark, is actually about what kind of future. It's not about that there is no future. Right? I think there is a future, but what kind of future and what we need to do to get to that kind of future. Okay, so I think in the book I mentioned about the need for regionalization, and I coined this phrase about doing well by doing good. Okay, let me give you an example. In 2004, when Singapore was very involved in helping the Aceh, which was very badly affected by the tsunami, right? The Singapore Armed Forces were the first to send relief to Aceh, right? And it was very deeply appreciated. I was involved in the Malabo, rebuilding of Malabo, which is on the Indian Ocean side. Yeah. And so I had a chance to meet some of the key people in the Sumatra administration. And they were very effusive in being very thankful for Singapore's help. And one of them, in fact, the mayor of Aceh, said in a public meeting that they will welcome Singapore's investment in northern Sumatra, where there are huge mineral resources, there are huge timber resources and so on, and they would be very happy to give special rights to Singapore. But we never took it up. Singapore never took it up. So this is a very important lesson that doing well, we could have done very well because we had done a lot of good. So in the book, I even suggested that we should build a hospital ship to go around the whole of Southeast Asian coastal villages to provide medical help and so on and so forth, right? Because I think there's a perception in Southeast Asia that Singapore is a bit too standoffish. We are too kind of westernized, Western-oriented. We are a bit arrogant with our success and so on. We look down on them. These are all very unnecessarily negative things, right? So we can certainly do more. I had a meeting with somebody very senior in Temasek Holding, who I cannot name, and I made the point that can we raise $1 trillion to use as a development fund to develop the region, right? Because I have this idea of, I call it eco-regional urbanization, in which we link together all the small towns and villages with e-commerce, and we have a vertical takeoff aircraft, right? That does not need a runway, because runways are very expensive, right? And I took a pilot's license, so I know something about flying. That as long as you fly below 500 feet, right, you will not be interfering with any of the commercial aircraft transit routes. So it's very easy to do, right? So for example, Singapore Batam or Singapore Bintang will be only 10 minutes, right? And you can take off and fly from any football field, anywhere. So this would mean that we can have a real interconnected ecosystem. So the person said to me from Temasek, $1 trillion, that's not a problem. We can even raise more than that because there's $73 trillion doing nothing in the world. A lot of it is black, brown, and gray money. But if we offer them 1%, all the money will come to us. The question thrown back at me was, do we have the people who are capable and trustworthy to use that money properly? And I confess, no, we don't have. So that's when I proposed, together with my retired architect colleagues, the concept of turning the whole of Singapore into an enterprise campus city, starting with NTU as a campus city, doubling the population, the daytime population of 40,000 to 80,000, so that we can rehouse onto every campus, starting with NTU, all the new startup companies, the young entrepreneurs, right, together with the students and the professors, right? NTU professors have a lot of inventions which have been patented, but which are not commercialized, right? Together with, when we house these people together with venture capital and so on, we can be triggering off a whole new generation of entrepreneurs, right? And if we bring the best and brightest students from Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, to live and learn with our students, the friendships formed will be the basis of the future development, okay? So now, the latest project that I'm involved with now is to, I have a discussion with the Singapore Institute of Architects, the NUS, and with SUTD to form a design research group to propose a new educational hub, a new enterprise campus in Johor SEZ. Okay? And interestingly, in a recent speech by Philip Yeo at the IPS meeting, did you all notice that? Philip was asked a question from the floor, what do you think of the Johor SEZ? He says it will fail. But the only viable project there is to have an educational center. And that's what we should do. So instead of NTU, which I had proposed, if we build a new campus city in Johor, the cost of living will be so much lower than Singapore, which means that the students from Indonesia, from Thailand, from all over Southeast Asia can live and learn there with our students. And that is the beginning, the core for a new Southeast Asia.
Thanks very much. That upbeat note. If you all would join me in thanking Mr. Tay.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. And I love those questions that you ask, which are very, very germane, very important, especially when they come from young people. Thank you.
And yeah, there are books over there if anybody's interested. I'm sure Mr. Tay will be happy to sign your book.
Now it's copy time.
Copy time.
Yeah.